Okay, here we are, Dan and Brendan talking this weekend morning, and a couple videos ago we had talked about people who who would not want to maybe not want to go back to work and sacrifice themselves on that altar, um, and how they really have kind of limited remedies right under the Constitution because. If the government's telling your employer to stay open, we were talking then about Donald Trump telling meatpacking plants, right, to stay open. So if the government's telling your employer to stay open, and your employer tells you to come back to work, and then you get fired, right, for not coming back to work, well, then your cause of action would be against the employer, unless you're going to call the employer a state actor, right, for constitutional purposes. And that's very difficult. That's a tough nut to crack. I mean, it's possible, but it's tough. And when you're stuck suing a private party, there's no constitutional claim there. We kind of left off that conversation wondering whether there was any kind of a due process claim once we got to the point where, that you go to apply for unemployment benefits, right, because you've now been fired from your job. And now you're dealing with the state, so maybe there would be a constitutional problem there. So I'll throw the ball over to your court and say, how does that work?
Yeah, so again, just to make sure we're clear on the sort of chain of events here, we begin with the president acting under the authority of the DPA, the Defense Production Act, telling employers like meatpacking plants that for various and sundry reasons, they have to keep their doors open. So employers then say to employees, we have to keep our doors open, so all of you come on back to work and stand shoulder to shoulder on the meatpacking line and cough on one another and sneeze at one another. And maybe we'll have masks and protective equipment, or maybe we won't. But in any event, this is just part of everybody having to take one for the team, so to speak. So what remedy does the employee have under those circumstances? As against the employer, there may or may not be statutory or common law remedies available. That's a question, needless to say, that's going to vary from state to state. And so that's something that we're not really in a position to take on here. Where things get a bit more interesting, and this is something that both Brendan and I have talked about having seen, is what he just alluded to, which is what happens when the state says to the employees, oh, by the way, if the employer calls you back and you say, thanks, no, I'd rather not die under these circumstances.
Well, who wouldn't want to do that?
Well, I mean, fair question. I understand. Look, in difficult times like these, I think we can all agree that the least we can do is to die in the cause of making money for multimillionaires and billionaires. That seems entirely reasonable to me, but it may not seem quite so reasonable to those people who are actually expected to stand shoulder to shoulder and suffer those consequences. So, what remedies do you have? Well, in some states, we have seen and read about state officers, the machinery of government, setting up, for example, a website where an employer can log on and report any employee who refuses to show up and work. The state will then create sort of a presumption. Any employee who refuses to show up and cites not wanting to die for the cause of COVID will be considered to have voluntarily separated from employment and thus will be ineligible for unemployment compensation benefits. The question then becomes, is there a constitutional claim there on the part of the employees? And Brendan and I have kind of kicked this around, and the answer seems to be yes, there would be a due process claim there, more particularly, in all likelihood, a procedural due process claim. And I'll kick it back to you. You can talk about the specific requirements of procedural due process and see where we go from there.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and it's a complicated question, but the 14th Amendment provides that the government, the state, is not allowed to take away life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And obviously what we're talking about here is somebody's job. Now, we could probably go on at length about whether there's a property interest involved here in somebody's job, but I think we should assume for the sake of this conversation that there is.
Or in the unemployment benefits themselves, right?
Yeah, and I think that's another wrinkle, right? Do you have property interest in benefits that you didn't already, right? It's one thing if the government takes benefits away from you. There's another question, right? If the government's saying you don't qualify for it, but even if we get over that hurdle, and probably we could, right? Then we have the requirement, the basic elements then of due process, because these terms. I try to discuss this with students all the time, right? You can't say that the Constitution can just be applied as it's written, because it's written in very vague general terms like due process, and that's not self-defining. So courts have said due process includes the right to notice, right? Some kind of notice that something bad is going to happen to you or has happened to you. A hearing, some kind of opportunity to tell your side of the story, and some impartial decision maker, right, to call the shots. And Dan and I were talking before we started the recording here. You know, you might succeed in a procedural due process case. You might succeed in having a federal court say, yeah, you were entitled to some kind of a hearing, maybe not before you got fired, but somewhere along the line, you're entitled to a hearing. But Dan, doesn't that just kick the ball? Kick the can down the road a little bit? You're going to get the same outcome. Some bureaucrat, if you're in a certain state, is just going to tell you, well, you don't qualify for the benefits. And so by then, your life is a shambles.
Yeah, and that raises an important point, which is, I don't know that we even, in a lot of these cases, get to the question of notice and an opportunity to be heard. The state, I think, is going to go after this at the entitlement stage, right? The threshold question in a procedural due process case like this, as you point out, is, has there been a deprivation of life, liberty, or property? When it comes to unemployment benefits, that's going to be considered a property interest. And as we recall from our studies of procedural due process, the question in a property case like this is there an entitlement to these benefits? Well, in most states, the question then comes down to, have you, the employee, been involuntarily separated from employment through no fault of your own? And that's where I think the state is going to go after this, right? The state's going to say, hey, look, you refuse to show up after the employer has issued a lawful notice to return to work. We're going to consider that a voluntary separation, and thus that defeats your entitlement to these benefits in the first instance. So I think that's where a lot of these claims are going to sort of founder on the rocks, if you will. If you manage to get past that, and again, these are some sort of deep in the weeds procedural due process questions, but if you manage to get past that, then you have to show that you were not afforded adequate process, which is to say notice and an opportunity to be heard, either pre-deprivation or post-deprivation. And as you just pointed out, so if you're an employee, and let's say you get past the first hurdle and can establish an entitlement to these benefits, then it's going to take you what? 60 days, 90 days to get a hearing? Well, by that point, you know, all bets are off. The landlord has kicked you out. The car's been repossessed. You're not able to put groceries on the table, and all of the bad things tend to follow. So whether we're talking about a constitutional remedy or not, the simple fact is these poor employees find themselves in an exceptionally unfavorable position, particularly when you stop and consider that a lot of the employees who are working under these circumstances are undocumented workers. And if you think those folks are going to be quick to take on the state on a procedural due process claim, I've got a bridge in Brooklyn I'd like to sell you.
Right, right. So it comes down to, there seems to be sort of a theme running through a lot of our conversations about this stuff. So, I mean, just to summarize here, if you have a due process claim, you're going to have, the first problem is going to be the state arguing you have no entitlement. We didn't take anything away from you to begin with because you weren't entitled to anything.
That's right.
And if you get past that hurdle, well, then you get yourself some nice procedures where you probably wind up in exactly the same situation, because, right, a hearing right, over which some impartial decision maker presides doesn't guarantee you a favorable outcome. It just means it takes longer, right?
Right.
To the outcome that's predetermined anyway. So here's the upshot. We sort of get what we vote for, right? And the Constitution's not going to save people from the government that they voted for. This is a political issue. The Constitution is not going to save you if you're in a state where the state government decides that people need to go back to work and risk their lives. There's going to have to be the political will on the part of people to address that. I don't see a constitutional remedy that's going to be effective.
In other words, to put it perhaps a bit too succinctly, I'm sure we've all heard this phrase before: elections have consequences. And one of the consequences is precisely what we're talking about here. To what extent are ordinary working folks who don't have the resources to take on the machinery of the state when their livelihoods are in jeopardy, to what extent are those folks really going to have any kind of an effective remedy at all?
Yep. That seems like the place to leave it off, and it looks like we're up against the clock again, so that's a good place to finish. But again, great conversation, and we'll be back a couple times a week to talk about what's on people's minds.
Stay safe, everybody.